Welcome to NAPCAN's fourth webinar in our National Child Protection Week series, Early Childhood Education and Care, ECEC, a powerful tool for child wellbeing. My name's Lisa Waters. I am the Deputy CEO of NAPCAN and part of a small team that coordinates National Child Protection Week each year. This year is National Child Protection Week's 30th anniversary, and I'm really glad that so many of you can be here to be part of this important conversation. I would like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the beautiful land where I am today. I'm in Canberra. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to acknowledge all of the elders past, present and emerging from all the lands that you might be watching from today, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who are logged on today. It's also really important to acknowledge the children because that's what this week is about and that's where culture will live on. So now a little bit of housekeeping. If you're like me, you're probably a little bit paranoid that you can be heard or that you can turn your camera on. You absolutely can't. It's a listen only function, so you can sit back and enjoy. If you do run into any technical issues, you can ring or email our team. There's a GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and there should be some contact details in the question chat box there. So fingers crossed that there aren't any technical difficulties, but please contact those staff members if there are. There's also a question chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. I'd really love to encourage as many of you to ask as many questions of Penny and Jay as you can and do that throughout the webinar. We will then be collating those questions and putting them to Jay and Penny later on in the session. There's also a handout section in the right-hand side of your screen. There is there's an image of the Bright Tomorrow's app that you will see there, and we'll put some links in the chat function a little bit later on. So this year's National Child Protection Week theme, Putting Children First, it recognises it's been a really hard year and challenging year for many. It's also important that in the midst of this, we remember to put children first. What we do now has an impact on children and how they will develop in the short and long term. When National Child Protection Week started in 1990, I'm sure none of us could have imagined it looking quite like this in 30 years' time. But the upside of the online format is that there's a much broader group of people that can be here today. And that's what National Child Protection Week's all about. It's about getting the message out there that everybody has a role to play in protecting and putting children first, not just this week, but every day. So today's session is all about Australia's early learning system. And if the registration figures are anything to go by, it's a topic of great interest. It's also a topic that's really close to NAPCAN's heart. We do a lot of work with early childhood centres, and many of the people on our mailing list work with young children. They know, and we all know, that the work they do is extremely powerful and sadly often undervalued. Any notions about the sector simply providing a child minding service for people returning to work have to go. On the contrary, these workers are putting children first. They nurture young minds, they support parents, they build relationships and social capital, and they link families to the services that they need. Unfortunately, because many of them are busy doing the things that they do, it's difficult for them to join the webinar series. But if they are here, hello to you all. So for our conversation today, I'm really excited to introduce two of the strongest, most influential early childhood advocates around. If I went through all of the achievements of both of them, we'd eat into a lot of valuable webinar time. So feel free to Google their amazing career paths and achievements when we finish. I'd like to start by introducing Jay Wetherill, the CEO of the Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 initiative and previous South Australia Premier for over 6 years. And also Penny Dakin, who is the CEO of the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, ARACY. For a long time, ARACY has been investing in research around early childhood development. So who better than the CEO of ARACY, Penny, to have a conversation with Jay about how we can make early childhood education a policy priority and how we can turn our knowledge into action. I'm going to hand over to you, Penny and Jay.
Thanks so much, Lisa. An absolute delight to be here with you and to be part of National Child Protection Week for 2020 And I speak on behalf of our team at ARACY. We're really always happy to partner with NAPCAN and the amazing work that you do. And thanks, Jay, for joining me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I've heard you describe yourself in recent weeks, Jay, as a recovering politician. I really like that description. And I think it's probably a good place to start. I mean, what makes a recovering politician like yourself want to get involved in these issues around early childhood development and early childhood education and care?
Well, I suppose a lot of us complete our political careers not always having achieved everything that we'd hoped to achieve. And so when I left a couple of years ago, I continued to do some volunteer work, one actually with your organisation, ARACY, and also with an international organisation, Reggio Children, because I was sort of persuaded that early childhood is the answer to really everything. If you get that right, you get just about everything else right. So, and you know, having spent a lot of time, I suppose I went into politics wanting to fix sort of injustices and problems. And the more I looked at, you know, the challenges, the more I realised they all had their origins in the early years. And so if you wanted to really shift the dial, you had to do something. Yeah, we did a fair bit in South Australia, but there's a lot more to be done. And so I was very keen to sort of continue the agenda, really.
So given all of that, and you know the commentary about, you know, everything starts in early childhood, and you know we couldn't agree more. Why is early childhood not seen as a priority? Why isn't it a major sort of focus of public policy in this country? And you know, what do you think we need to do to change that?
Well, babies can't talk, which is well, at least not in a comprehensible way for a few years at least. So that's a fundamental problem. And, you know, parents, so what's the other constituency? Parents, well, they're very busy. You know, it's a time of their life when they're obviously engaged in this, you know, incredible enterprise of bringing up young children. So they tend not to be easily motivated as a group of people. The one group which is the permanent sort of voice, if you like, of children are the educators, the people that are with them. And they continue to, the children don't grow old with them, they just keep cycling through, so they're always with them. And so they're a powerful, you know, voice, but they're only, you know, one group. And so the truth is that it's a very crowded public policy agenda. You know, in a media saturated society, everybody is trying to actually get their issue up and make that, and make it salient and resonate in the minds of the community, so that politicians respond to that as opposed to something else. And, you know, there's a lot of, you look at just at the moment, you've got, you know, COVID, the economic collapse associated with it. You've got, you know, climate change. I mean, all of these things competing for air and attention. And it's not easy to put early childhood development on the national political agenda and motivate a coalition for change. But so really what hasn't happened is there hasn't been a concerted coalition building exercise. There's been some powerful things. Indeed, ARACY itself is an example of trying to pull together a whole lot of disparate parts of the early childhood development sector and create a voice and a clearinghouse, if you like, for ideas and quality research. But it's necessary but not sufficient, and I suppose that leads us to where we're trying to take the matter. That's a campaign.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that obviously speaks to, you know, innumerable barriers in that discussion. I mean, what do you see as the structural impediments that currently are standing in the way of the construction of Australian early childhood development system that you know we would like to see, that embeds all of the elements that support high quality early childhood development, including early years education, into it?
Well, the impediments are that there's no one single level of government which is accountable or responsible for the early years. So, and even within governments, there's no one agency that's got single responsibility. We like to talk about there being 5 service systems. There's probably many more, but just for a start, we think there's childcare, what we currently call childcare, but many of us would like to call early learning. We've got preschool, which is sort of more of an incident of the education system. There's child protection, the statutory and other services associated with child protection. There's infant and maternal health, which obviously is connected to the health system. And then there's a more amorphous thing, the community and family support area. And that's without counting all the specialist services and allied health and disability services. So there's 5 principal service systems which interact with the lives of children and families in those first 5 years. But they're really not the main thing any of those agencies do. And so it tends to fall to, so for instance, the health minister is obviously consumed, well, at the moment by COVID, but generally speaking, consumed by public hospitals. And then to the extent that there's any time left, you know, it's on other matters well before you get down to the early childhood and infant maternal health system. And you see that replicated across all of these service systems. And of course, at Commonwealth level, the really big element there, childcare, is not even really created to be part of the early childhood development system. It's really more incident of employment policy, and very much its structure and its form is dominated by those considerations, not by the development of children. Although it's incrementally in the last 10 years, it's moved in that direction. It's by no means, that's not its genesis or its reason for existence.
So I guess this brings us back to the campaign, and it'd be great if you could just talk a little bit about it. I'm sure many people who have been online saw or attended the launch event last week. I guess, what is your vision for the campaign, and why was that the topic that you thought you guys would throw your weight behind and really create a campaign for a vision for the future for?
Well, I suppose the first thing is everybody on this call is persuaded about the importance of the first 5 years and thinks that there should be very much more resources and coordination. So I take that as a given. Query, why haven't we been able to get the change that we all believe is necessary? And I suppose our analysis is that while we've had excellent arguments, what we haven't had is the pressure for change on the political process. How do you bring pressure to bear on the political process? Well, you have to build a broad coalition around a very clear campaign goal. And so the coalition has to be everybody in this room and beyond, all those service systems, the nurses, the teachers, the social workers, everybody that is involved in the life of children in those first 5 years. We want that service system to be motivated to basically create pressure for change. Now, how we do that? We can't do that just by ourselves. We need to build broader coalitions, and those broader coalitions have to be with parents and any other coalitions that we can build. And so in a sense, the arrowhead for the campaign around which we think we can build this coalition are the difficulties and problems with the current childcare system. And we think there are fundamentally 3 key sort of messages that as a coalition building exercise. One is it's not sufficiently about early learning. The bias is about childminding, of course, and quality needs to improve, and it needs to be much more about that. Second is that it's ferociously expensive, and that puts real pressure on young families just starting out. It's a real barrier to accessibility for many families, and not just the money, but all the inflexibilities and bureaucracy around accessing childcare. And thirdly, a really powerful argument that motivates a big coalition is women. Women basically, well, strictly speaking, second income earners, but typically women are disadvantaged by the current system. It really punishes anyone that wants to work more than part-time, and that it's bad for them and their lifelong earnings, but it's bad for the economy. And so those 3 powerful arguments about what's wrong with the current system allow us to build quite a broad coalition of support, which then is, in a sense, the, if you like, step 1 in trying to rebuild this system that we imagine. Because if you can build out a universal high quality early learning system on the back of our current childcare system, you really create the opportunity to build out this early childhood development system that we imagine. So at the moment, we've got this system which is, so at the state level, states appear around the birth of a child, then they disappear and then reappear at 4 years of age at preschool. And in the middle, there's this big childcare thing, which is not really meant to be or pretends to be part of that system. So this gives us the opportunity, if you like, it's the hole in the donut, as it were, that needs to be filled in so that we can then create a coherent system. And so there's a sequence to this that we're seeking to pursue.
Look, and from my perspective and from ARACY's perspective, it's certainly something that, you know, we really couldn't agree with you more. Fundamentally, that we've done a lot of evidence gathering over, you know, the nearly 20 years of our existence about exactly what it takes for a child to thrive, and we've tried to embed that through our NEST framework, which actually speaks to, you know, it doesn't match exactly, but it certainly parallels nicely the service systems that you've described. And, you know, for anyone on the call who hasn't heard anybody of us here at ARACY talk about it before, but the NEST essentially says that, you know, for a child in this country to thrive, they have to have 6 basic elements of their well-being, you know, catered for, and that they need to be valued, loved, and safe. They need to have their material basics needs met. They need to be healthy, and they need to be learning, which is the important, you know, direct interaction here with what you're talking about. But they also need to be able to participate, and, you know, for all children, that means, you know, to participate in their communities and in their family and in the decisions and decision making around the things that matter to them, and also that they have to have a positive sense of their own identity and culture. And I just see that so much of the stuff you're talking about from the campaign's perspective, you know, both the arrowhead part about early childhood education, but also the broader vision, is completely aligned with that framework.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the NEST is a really robust and powerful evidence-based tool which guides our thinking. And it seems to me that once we open this door up with this sort of campaign, which is really about the deficiencies in the childcare system, and which we were always proposing to do, but has got quite a big fillip with COVID really revealing the real weaknesses in that sector. Once that door is open, then we can walk through and build out this service system in the way in which you've just described, because that's what it should look like. Now, of course, having said that, these are very general descriptions. The distance between where we are now and getting to that service system is quite, you know, there's quite a lot of work and thinking that needs to go into that. And so, you know, there's another body of work behind the scenes about how to try and create this system, because, you know, in this area, you know, especially the child protection area, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If I might recall my sort of confirmation, you know, you can actually make things worse if you're not careful. So, you know, not all reform is good reform. So we need to be careful. You know, we need to make sure that we're moving forward and that we're not, we don't take missteps. So this is. You know, this is a really ferociously complex public policy area, trying to get 5 service systems and knit them together. But I think if the basic principle is the child is at the centre, and using the NEST as the guiding principle, you can't go too wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting that you talk about the journey that we have to go on from where we start to ideally where we want to be. And I think, you know, a number of years ago now, ARACY led a group of prominent experts in the field, the child protection field, to create what we like to say, we literally wrote the book on, you know, how we do some of this child protection system stuff better. The document was called Inverting the Pyramid, and it talked about the need to flip investment to a public health approach to child protection, where we saw the bulk of the investment go away from tertiary services and the need to be funding, you know, genuine tertiary intervention to flipping the pyramid. So the bulk of funding and support went to early intervention and prevention activities. The problem with that model and that flipping of that pyramid is always that there needs to be a crossover period where you actually just have to fund both, because you can't you can't flip overnight. There's always going to be the need for these tertiary services until you can really get yourself set up well with your prevention and early intervention. And I think the reason that has struggled is that, I imagine from your time in government, that it's a really difficult proposition to say, well, actually you're going to have to fund both for a period of time. And I guess the ECEC reforms that you're talking about and the broader childhood development reforms potentially have some of the same problems.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive challenge for governments, but you're right. I don't think there is any way out of continuing to invest in the failing, to be frank, tertiary system, while you are actually trying to rebuild this other system. We had thought, I mean, there's a fantastic piece of work done by the Centre for Child Protection, arising out of a Royal Commission we had into our child protection system in South Australia, where they looked at these awful statistics of 1 in 4 children by the age of 18, I think, might have even been less, by 12 maybe even, had a child protection notification. And it had been thought, the working thesis was that there was over-notification. The frightening conclusion is that there wasn't an over-notification. A very high proportion of those notifications were about real risk of serious harm, which sort of backs up your point that you can't switch this system off. You can't sort of fail to intervene, even though the resources required, investigation and removal, are just such a frighteningly expensive and ultimately not a very good solution. But once you're in that world, there are a few options. You can't turn a blind eye to what's going on inside some of these families. So this is it is a challenge for governments. They're going to have to run an old system while they invest in a new one. And the challenge is that you won't see the results for some time. So it requires you to stay the course for a considerable period before you'll start to see the results flowing through the system. And that's why I think ultimately, the public health approach is really consistent with the universal accessible early learning system, which is really I see as the spine on which you can then build all these other things. You can then hang some of these specialist services off the universal platform.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge that, for many families who are, involved either as carers within the child protection system and other elements of that child protection system, early education and care is already playing a fundamental role in supporting those families, in walking that journey with those families, in providing additional support and care. And I think what the point that you're making is that the campaign and the things that hang from that actually give more, potentially and hopefully more power for them to be able to do that better. There are some really good examples where that's working.
Exactly, and we, during this brief period of so-called free childcare, even though it wasn't actually free, but anyway, it felt that way for some of the parents for a while. A lot of people took up childcare in a way that they hadn't done before, especially some vulnerable families. Some interesting anecdotal information coming from Aboriginal childcare organisations where they saw children and families they hadn't seen before, which is really powerful because that visibility on the child, it gives you the opportunity to help them and their families in a way that can potentially avoid and divert future connections with the statutory child protection system. And it seems to me, I think we had a little glimpse of the future during that brief period, and it gave us great hope about what might be able to be achieved in the future.
Indeed. I think we've certainly at ARACY had some fabulous anecdotal stories from childcare or early learning centres that really expanded their remit during that period and actually cared for families in a way that that you described. Actually had the ability to be supporting families through additional meals or through arranging additional appointments for them, and connecting them with the wider service system around them in ways that they had only dreamed of being able to do before. I'm not sure entirely what gave them the ability to do that, but you know, potentially the change in their funding arrangements or how it, you know, the needs of the family maybe were more apparent. But we've certainly seen it as a good boiling pot for creating something new.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just the being out from underneath all the logistical requirements of dealing with Centrelink is not a bad start. I think that's a big barrier. Even leaving aside, you know, your potential entitlement, just having to deal with that and being worried about whether you're meeting or not meeting the eligibility requirements and whether they might trigger repayment obligations. You know, if you especially if this is a finely balanced judgment, if you have parents that don't necessarily have the whole experience-based brain development story in their mind and the value of early learning, you know, these become marginal judgments they make based on convenience or concerns and just how they feel about the whole idea. You might even be concerns about quality in some circumstances with legitimate concerns. So, I mean, what needs to be said though is that while we talk about problems in the early, you know, the early learning system or childcare system, there are also pockets of excellence, you know, where all of the things we imagine that we want to build the system out generally do exist. So, you know, we want them just to be, rather than to be ad hoc and occasional, we want them to be everywhere. And I think, you know, that's the thing. I mean, the truth is a lot of educators in the childcare system do very much more than what they're paid for, and certainly, you know, this is a very under-remunerated, undervalued sector, and they do many of the things just instinctively and because of their training and their understanding that we would like to see, you know, institutionalised and made part of the system generally, not just relying upon just some local heroes.
Yeah, I just heard you mention brain development, and certainly it was a big focus of your discussion both in the press and actually at the launch event last week. And you know, it's an absolute passion of mine. Is it a cornerstone of where you're going with the campaign?
Yeah, it is. I mean, at two levels. One is it's highly motivating. Once people, but parents in particular, hear the story about how a child's brain develops in the first 5 years, it's impossible not to, you know, to unhear it. It's almost miraculous, and it's not a story of just children, you know, learning like sponges. It's an interaction. It's an active, experienced, high-quality, experience-based learning process, which involves deep connections between the child and their parent principally, but also the child and the educator. And this, you know, Donna Cross has a lovely phrase where she describes the things that we can do, the service system, our parenting app, Bright Tomorrows, all those things that we can do with families as being the bridge between the educators, the bridge between the evidence and the parents. I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about it, because this is miraculous. Like it's an incredible story about how children's brain develop. It doesn't happen by itself. It happens as a product of high quality interactions and experiences, a number of which you've described in the nest. Play-based learning is another way of talking about it, but and it's the building blocks for the rest of the child's life. As the famous economist James Heckman describes it, skills beget skills. So these building blocks are the capabilities on which all the other skills, which we then learn at school and in later life, are built. And you know, in fact, some of the higher order functions, of course, are laid down in the early years that are so crucial. The organisational skills, the emotional regulation skills, the interpersonal interaction skills, all of those things, which are just so powerful for all the jobs that are now in the growing parts of the economy. They're the things that we now. So this is a story about health and well-being, but it's also a story about prosperity and you know, advancement at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the society. I think once people hear it, it's such a motivating story, so it drives our campaign. But of course, there's another bit about it, and that's it's intrinsically important, you know, for parents and their relationship with their children. So it's not just about support for our campaign; it's also about how children and parents interact. That's why we promote the Bright Tomorrows Act so strongly in the campaign. So when we talk about a system of early learning, it's not just about what governments do or non-government organisations do. It's also what parents do and all the informal networks that swarm around them.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's certainly it's going to be a priority for us into 2021, brain development and how we share that brain development story with people at all levels, parents, educators. I agree with Donna. I think that the early years educators are a fabulous conduit of that message, the evidence to the people who need it. Really interestingly, some fabulous work that we've been doing here at ARACY recently has been talking about the significance of the development of those high-level functions, as you say, ones that we particularly are interested, focused on around self-efficacy and executive functioning, as you say, completely and utterly laid down in those early years. But I think one of the other elements that really interests us in that is that there are other points in the life of a child and the life of a person when we can actually be making some differences on those as well. We're particularly interested in that first 1,000 days of a child's life when the brain pathways are first being formed, but we're also really interested in the power of those middle years, that period between 8 and 14, which I've heard George Patton described as the next best opportunity to actually really work with these kids and their families and help do some of that work around the development of brain and brain skills. But also, which is why I think that your app is such a great idea, Jay, is that we know that the transition to parenthood is actually another really important time when we can be actually working with families where parents are open to changing and they're open to thinking about the way they do things and altering that and improving themselves to be better parents potentially than they had. And it's another really exciting opportunity when we can actually take those brain development messages and in those instances take them with a 2-generational focus. So thrilled that that's a focus of where you're going with the campaign.
Yeah, and of course the app is the intellectual sort of grunt behind it is supported by Telethon Kids Institute. So Professor Donna Cross, and then they have a relationship with the Bezos Foundation internationally that has these 1,000 tips. Which, and as you say, I think the difference between this app and say some other parenting apps is that this one has these 1,000 tips, but it curates them in a way which it's described as, instead of going to a library like a lot of apps are, the librarian meets you at the door here and sort of provides you a tailored experience. So, and it is very much about that dual generational thing. Subtly, parents are also being educated in this role. And look, it's a very powerful device, and we're looking to promote it as broadly as we. It's free, of course, and you just download it from the App Store, and we just want it in as many hands of as many parents as we possibly can. Because we just think it's incredibly valuable. Yeah.
Look, I think that's it's so good to hear that, and some fabulous work that's been done by our colleagues at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and Social Ventures Australia, a project called Restacking the Odds. People may be familiar with it, but that work was really designed to look at how you would put a combination of interventions together that actually gave you your best bang for your buck from an investment point of view. What are the things that we know can actually work in those crucial first years to drive better outcomes for kids? And the three big things that they found. The first one was around high quality sustained nurse home visiting, which again is another big passion of mine with ARACY. But the other one, not surprisingly, was around high quality early years education and care. And obviously, you've spoken about how quality is a major pillar of the campaign work you're doing. But the third tranche of activity that study found was around parenting support and high quality parenting support as well. So, I think if we can come up with a system that actually addresses, that includes in its creation, all three of those elements, we're probably on our way to getting it right.
I think you're right, Penny, and just to explain how these things in our sort of conception become part of the campaign and the service system. Of course, we start with the childcare system because of its obvious defects, and it's a really important backbone. But it's not to let the states off the hook either. The states have important elements of the service system they could build out, and some states are starting to do that. So 3-year-old preschool at the level of Victoria, I think, are pursuing that. And I think I noticed the ACT announced that their intention to pursue that just the other day. And some states have trialled or piloted the universal nurse home visiting system, but it's tended to drop away. So that could be built out. And so you can imagine that the system almost meeting at either end, could be built out at the Commonwealth and the state level. The other thing is that the income support, the material support for families, the cost of childcare is a critical element in that. If you could reduce that burden on families, that would make a powerful difference to the money that's going out. Typically, average family, 27% of their income spent on childcare fees. That's a hell of a lot of money, and a couple of $100 a week after tax. So that's a big burden. It's hard to imagine an income transfer of that significance that in any other sphere that you could actually apply that would reduce that amount of pressure on families. So we think all those elements you've just discussed can find their representation in this design we're imagining.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the system that you're talking about, as we've said, is it's underpinned by this notion of quality. And I think one of the we've talked this afternoon about there are some centres, there are some places of real excellence at this in the country, but I think you had some stats last week around the percentage of centres that are not meeting those quality standards. So whatever we do, it's got to really address that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. 18% of centres not meeting national quality standards. But at its heart, there's a sort of an issue here, which is that the pay and valuing of our early educators. I mean, it's just not okay that people doing similar work in primary schools are paid so very much more. It's not just the remuneration, it's also the precarious nature of the employment. And we saw that on show really powerfully during COVID when we sort of had the education system, school system stood up and the childcare system fell over. And there's no obvious reason why this should be treated as an any less valuable part of the life and development of children. And in fact, arguably, it's even more important. And yet it suffers from substandard arrangements for the people that work in it. So this is a very, very big issue, the question of quality standards.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to preempt because I'm sure when I do hand back to Lisa in a couple of minutes, it'll probably almost certainly be a question, and I'll save the time. What are you hoping that people who are on the line with us today will do to get behind the campaign? What's your vision for our role? What can we as ordinary citizens do?
Two practical things. Download the app, the Bright Tomorrows app, and have a look at it. So it's great even for practitioners to have conversations with parents, because we know that the trusted advisor is the critical vector of communication in this area, and encourage others to do so. The other is join the campaign. So go to thriveby5.org.au and you'll see how the campaign's constructed, and it will, once you register there, then you'll be able to get updates about what we're doing. And it's important to say though that while we've got a general idea about what we want to do, which is quality, universally accessible early learning system for this country, that the construction of that will really be will be in the hands of the people that are on this call and others who understand this system. Our job isn't to, we're just trying to provide a platform to bring people together to then represent our position to government. But the precise details of this really will be powerfully influenced by people like the people on this call, getting involved. So please register. There's no obligations. I mean, it just simply allows you to choose to be part of the campaign in whatever way you choose to be involved. But it will give you information about how things are going, and you will actually shape the campaign. I mean, your content will create stories. The stories will build coalitions, and the coalitions will become powerful and influence change. And one thing that has always struck me about politics is that when you stand up and say something, it's amazing. There's a whole lot of people out there that are thinking the same thing, but have not necessarily seen a place where they can go to add their voice. And that's what we're trying to do. We're simply trying to create a place where we can all raise our voice and show the political process that this is something that shouldn't be a second order priority. It should be a first order priority.
Yeah, for all children, including children who are engaged in the child protection system, including
Absolutely.
Everybody.
Absolutely, every child. It's not just about disadvantaged children, although disadvantaged children will be helped the most by these changes, but it's about every child thriving and to be the very best they can be. And we see children even in quite fortunate sort of suburbs who are missing out. I mean, it's not a phenomenon which is confined to low socioeconomic suburbs, as many of the people on the call would know.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thanks for that, Jay. And on that, I think I'll throw back to you, Lisa. Jay and I could probably sit and have this conversation for a few hours. Probably have. But I know you've been looking at some questions, and I think it's a good opportunity to let those be asked.
Yes, and rightly. So Penny preempted many of the questions that have been coming through the chat function, but I'll actually throw this one to you, Jay, because as Penny initially asked you, why aren't we making progress if we have all the evidence, why aren't we able to convince politicians of the value of a more accessible early learning system? You did say, Jay, that it's a crowded public policy agenda and we need to cut through it. Is framing this research helpful in this? Is framing the research helpful in this? We heard about the early childhood development framing research by Reframing Core Story research with the Australian from Charlottethon Kids Institute this morning, the Frameworks Institute this morning. Yeah. So I'm wondering what your thoughts about framing that research are.
Yeah, well, we're proud to have supported that work from Frameworks, and I had a previous call where we briefed our Core Story partners just a few days ago, where Nat Kendall-Taylor and myself both spoke, and we talked about the connection between the Core Story messaging and this campaign. And the truth is that the Core Story messaging is vital. It's about how we use language in a way which creates the strongest support for our cause. But it's necessary but not sufficient, because we've been providing important, well-researched, high-quality messages for a significant period of time. And while we've raised awareness, we haven't got the cut through from the political process. And I suppose what I would say is missing is a campaign of the sort that we're now seeking to pursue. A campaign that can mobilise, tens of thousands of people, and frankly, make it a question. If we have to extract a political penalty for people that don't agree with us. I mean, that's to put it in brutal political terms. People have to say, well, this is a vote changer for me. I actually care about this, and I'm going to raise my voice, and I'll also be around come election time to make my voice heard. And when politicians see enough people saying the same thing, they act, and I think if you want a model of something which worked really well, it was the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Now, leaving aside the problems with that scheme, there were some issues with its design, and it's still being rolled out, but you can't underestimate the achievement. A National Disability Insurance Scheme which doubled the amount of funding that goes into disability. In my state, I remember in the time we were spending $700 million on disability. In NDIS, it was 1.4 billion, doubling the amount of money going in. Now, that happened because there was a nationwide campaign, Every Australian Counts, and it drew together a broad cross-section of people, because all up to that point, all of the disability sector were just doing their own thing, you know, just pleading for their own particular subset, because they obviously, you know, had their own interests to protect. But they came together around a single ask, a single campaign goal, and they got bipartisan support. Every federal MP signed up to this because they could see the power of the movement that was being. So that's, we need a. The short answer is we need a campaign.
Penny, have you got anything to add to that?
I would agree with what Jay said. I think it is important for us to acknowledge, and we actually, you know, at the National Early Years Summit, which we held earlier this year, it feels like about 35 years ago, but it really was only about 7 months ago. We did talk about this, and we talked about it. Jay spoke, but Amanda Rishworth also stood up. We had her for a very short period of time in the middle of the second day, and she said that indeed that was the thing. We had to make it politically more dangerous or politically more detrimental for politicians not to do the things that we were talking about than it was for them to ignore it. And the only way that we can do that is by people, you know, politicians act as they're voted. So, you know, if their constituency aren't going to vote for them for ignoring an issue, then they won't ignore an issue because they want the votes. They want to be re-elected. I'm sure they have more altruistic ideas, Jay, too, but, you know, being re-elected is, you can't do it if you're not there. And I think that's the power of the campaign. The campaign is about, you know, changing the way we vote. ARACY, in the lead up to the last election, produced our election ask document, which sort of, against each of those 6 domains of the nest, stated what we felt were the best 6 investments the federal government could make. The document was called "They Don't Vote, But They Do Matter," which goes back to, you know, the Richard Dennis's discussion yesterday during your launch. It goes back to stuff Jay was talking about earlier. You know, these kids don't get to vote, and, you know, the responsibility on us as their parents and on responsible adults who vote in this system is to vote for the politicians or for the parties that are going to actually respond to this issue. And without that vote mobilisation that Jay's been talking about, ultimately, we won't change anything.
Right, thank you for that. Did you want to add something else, Jay?
I think that the sector is used to polite, respectful, intelligent lobbying behind closed doors so as not to embarrass governments. Look, you know, I don't know whether that. I think we need to be more assertive, and I think that's what this campaign is about. And it's not to say we're not respectful. Of course, we will be respectful, but we have to be much more public, I think, in our advocacy, and that's really, I suppose, what we're trying to bring is to raise our voices and to be heard.
But I guess effectively the campaign does give us that polite way to collectively do that as well.
Sure,
okay.
I mean, we're not going to be rude, we're just going to be noisy.
Yeah, of course. Okay, another question from the audience to both of you. So Penny, I might get you to start. How can a reform of our current early childhood system better serve and improve access for our vulnerable children who live in poverty and experience abuse and neglect? Will universal access deliver that, or do we need a more proactive approach? And I'll give you another part of that question when you answer that.
Yeah, because that's really quite full.
Yeah.
Look, it's a really good question, and it's a long-term question. We've been asking ourselves the question between universalism versus targeted approaches versus universal proportionalism for a really long time. And in fact, I'm going to quote Jay and steal your thunder, Jay. The lovely way I heard Jay describe this at the National Early Years Summit was that, you know, universal access allows us to open the door. And it's our responsibility then, as people who work in this field with vulnerable populations, with marginalised people, with people who are experiencing adversity, to actually make sure we work really hard and bring them through that open door with us. The universality allows the door to open, and then the things that we know that work really well with those families or engage those families or are additions that you need on top of your universality are the responsibility of advocates and policymakers to think carefully about as you design what this universal system looks like. One thing that I feel really we don't talk enough about is that when we say universal, it doesn't mean the same thing for every child. It doesn't mean it looks the same. That's not what we're talking about. A universal system allows everyone to be able to use it. Absolutely everyone, regardless of what you look like, where you live, all of those things. It's the entry point, and what the targeting allows us to do is to design and to work with these marginalised populations to actually make sure that what we're delivering actually meets their needs.
Yeah, look, I was a child protection minister for more years than I care to remember. And one of the things that struck me is that the most dangerous place for a child is in an isolated family. So that the more visible that we can make children in our society, the more places that we can create where them and their families are welcome and that they're attracted to, the more likely it is that we're going to avoid some of the worst things that happen. So that universal platform, I think, is crucial. It gives us line of sight to the little children, and we can get there before anything bad happens. But ironically, almost paradoxically, politically, it's easier to run an argument about a universal system because there's something in it for everyone. And, the way to think of it is everybody gets something, but some people get more. That's much more powerful than just designing a system around disadvantage. Because then if you use the language of disadvantage, you tend to get some very unfortunate stereotyping of the sort of families that we're supporting. And it undermines the political support for the reform that we're trying to build.
Good framing, Jay. Reframing that, yeah. Nat Kendall-Taylor would be impressed with that. Second part of that question was, you both spoke about the free childcare in response to the pandemic and the benefits for children. So would it be right to say that COVID has actually provided a good platform for the campaign because we can see that it's actually possible?
Do you want to kick off, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sadly, yes. I mean, do you imagine how hard it would have been to put early childhood on the agenda absent COVID? Yeah. I mean, so it's done that. It's revealed, like, why did the health system stand up? Why did the education system stand up? Why did the childcare system fall over? I mean, they're powerful questions that need to be asked. Why we got a substandard service system for one section of society but not for another? So it posed those questions and put it on the agenda in a way which is impossible to ignore. It did a little trial. It showed us what free looked like, and of course we now have some anecdotal evidence. It'd be great to gather and see exactly what happened. But the other thing about COVID, I think, is that it also it changed almost our value system about what's important. I mean, we were really confronted with this existential threat, and we had to ask ourselves what's important in life. And immediately you start thinking about family and well-being, and so I think it's put care and well-being powerfully back on the agenda. I mean, at a fundamental level, what we've done as a world is we've chosen human well-being over money. I mean, that's what's happened. And some people are a bit grumpy about that, but that's what we've done. And it's been universally accepted. So, this is a very powerful new set of values, I think. And of course, because our economy is smashed, we now have to think about rebuilding. And so when you think about rebuilding, I mean, these were always great arguments, investing in the early years. There was always a massive payoff. But now I wonder, as we start to think about rebuilding over 10, 20 years, you can start to look at some of these long-term payoffs in a way that probably was more difficult to do when things were going a bit better.
I think COVID's done a couple of really interesting things, well, more than a couple, but a couple that's worth pointing out. It's a fabulous piece of research that came out of the UK post the global financial crisis. And what they did is they spent some time examining the economic recoveries of a number of European nations and particularly how they framed their economic recovery post GFC. And what that study found was that the economies that had invested into their own care economy, so things like early childhood education, health and human services, those type of things, actually did really significantly better than economies that actually invested solely in infrastructure and those type of hard economies. Some of that is about the fact that women tend to take up employment in the care economy, and women, we've heard it talked about as the pink recession coming out of COVID, and I think there's something in that for us to think about as a nation, and I think if we can find ways of being able to do that through investments into early childhood education and care, for instance, I think that's a powerful economic argument. I think the other interesting thing that COVID has done, and something we've really grappled with here at ARACY, is that it's changed what adversity looks like. We know that it's not only deepened adversity in our communities, there are people who had very little to start with who have got even less. It's actually broadened the experience of adversity as well. There are families who are living in really difficult times, and there's some discussion that any child that's living through this COVID pandemic is experiencing an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. So there are whole groups of cohorts within our society who have never known adversity like they're experiencing at the moment through COVID, and are don't necessarily have in place the mechanisms to be able to respond to that. Help-seeking behaviour is really difficult. It's really hard to ask for help for all of us, particularly if we're not used to needing to ask for help. And I know that that's something that the children's commissioners, for instance, are really grappling with in the child protection space, but also in the child wellbeing space. How do we support families who are not used to asking for help? And that's where I think that this idea of a universal platform where we can actually get access to these families and to actually see them and walk beside them in universal ways that are non-stigmatizing and non-judgmental allow us to be able to that in different ways, and that I think is the power of COVID. We did some work a couple of years ago for one of the jurisdictional governments, and I was speaking with a centre director, early childhood centre director, and she said the most beautiful thing to me, which was that her staff had the power to be able to discern when a bad day stopped being a series of bad days and was actually becoming a problem. And we're able to really work firsthand with that family from the moment that stopped being a series of bad days and actually became that problem. And I think that's something that COVID has opened up the ECEC space to be able to work in more deeply.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Jay. I'm just mindful of the time. We've got 2 minutes. I'm just wondering, is there one quick take home that you'd like to leave for the audience, the attendees?
Yes, take out your phone. Oh, sorry, go on, Penny. Take out your phone, get the App Store, Bright Tomorrow's app, download it, and then after you've done that, type in thriveby5.org.au and register to be part of the campaign. Thank you.
Mine is a really quick shout out to everybody who works in the child protection system, including my best mate, who is a frontline child protection worker. You are all doing the most ridiculously hard and wonderful job every single day, and thank you for that. Thank you for the sacrifices that you make to do that. You are to be commended for that work, and we know that we're all supporting you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So thank you, Penny and Jay. You did an amazing job in getting through so much content in that time. I guess one of the take-home messages could be, if COVID has showed us anything, if it is that if there's a political will, action can happen. So as Jay said, after the webinar closes, fill in our very brief survey and then jump onto the Thrive by 5 website and be part of that campaign, so that we can change the accessibility of the early childhood education care sector. And let's make it our community's priority. So I guess, as Thrive by 5 website so clearly puts it, Australia's early learning system needs reform, and you can make it happen. I really feel that we can empower each other and we can help this campaign progress. We will be sending out an email with some of the other questions that we will send through to Penny and Jay that we didn't get to today. Finally, for the rest of the week, it's not too late to sign up for some other webinars. They're on our website. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I really appreciate you joining us. And Penny and Jay, thank you again. It was really informative. Really enjoyed it.